Well, it's almost 10 o'clock, so I'd like to start now. Before I show you the slides, first of all, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming this morning on the last day. It's our 9th and last session. We will not be having a 10th one next week. We just somehow or other worked out only 9 this year. And at the very end, I'm going to show a slide proposing a new method of meeting together starting in February the 21st at Oakwood, but it will be a hybrid presentation so that those who live at Oakwood or live nearby can come and talk in person, and those from out of town can come and join us by Zoom. So we have, I hope that will work out to everyone's satisfaction, but what I also would like to do is suggest about 10 topics. I will start in the last slide with 6 and ask you to provide another 4 and possibly more if you don't like some of the 6 that I've suggested. And we can democratically come up and winnow it down to 10 and then have you act as participants and leaders in discussions so that we don't have so many slides, preferably possibly even none for some of the sessions, and simply have group discussions. So that's my hope for the spring. I think it will be a change back to the original way we started 11 years ago, and be a little less lecture oriented and a little more group oriented, which I think is part of the idea of PLATO. Also, I'd like to spend a little less time preparing lectures and inviting speakers and share the wealth with all of you. So before I get into the slides, I'd like to show you 2 books that I'm reviewing today. This first one is called The Climate Diet, and it's written by Paul Greenberg. It's a short little soft cover that only goes for about 130 pages. And I will just take some highlights from this, but it's a very good book. Paul Greenberg is the author of the James Beard Award-winning bestseller, 4 Fish, American Catch, The Omega Principle, and Goodbye Phone, Hello World. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times and lives in New York. He's done a nice job. And we'll just focus on the part that relates to diet. This other one, spend a little more time on. This is called Technically Food, Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Challenge What We Eat. And this is some pictures of a cracked egg and growing it in tissue culture, something like that. Her name is Larissa Zimberoff. And so we'll go right to the slides now, and we'll start with Greenberg's book. And we just have about 40 slides, so it shouldn't be a long day. Let's see, share screen. And let's see if we can get this one. Okay. And we'll go to full screen. All right, I'll minimize this. All right. So that is the first book in the title page. There we come, advanced slides. And this is some preamble slides. These are not directly from the book, but the slides that have been come across my desk. I said before jumping into Greenberg's book, let's begin with a few facts. We tend to look ahead to 2050, and this is global here. And the point from the World Research Institute, it's a few years old, is that the world needs to close a 70% food gap. That's the predicted increase in the need for food because our population, in spite of COVID, is expanding, and there are too many people near starvation. And so we're going to need to improve food production and reduce waste in various ways that we'll talk about today. This continues on another few slides from the World Resources Institute. It's a prediction with a vertical hashed line there being made around 2010 or so and extrapolated beyond then. So we don't have data going out to 2020, and they've projected it out to 2050. And you can see the world is represented in a heavy line there. Has to do with calorie consumption specifically, and you can see that we are at the top, European Union right behind us, Brazil and China, a little bit lower between there and the average for the world. Ethiopia is at the bottom, and I'm sure that projected line is wrong. That's going to be going down, I think, for quite a little while before the world recognizes it and tries to rescue them from their current famine. I've been to Ethiopia, and that was under good times back around 2004 or so. Things were pretty good then, but they really deteriorated with the near civil war and chaos that's going on now. This is focusing now on protein as opposed to just total calories. And what's interesting in this slide is that what's shown in orange-brown is animal-based protein, and what's shown in green is plant-based protein. And then there are various countries from India starting on the left to US and Canada on the right. And it's an interesting gradation where you see, except for Middle East and North Africa, that there is quite a lot of, there's quite a lot of animal-based protein, is a way to put it. And it's an interesting slide in that it shows a gradual progression. Also, what's interesting in the heavy line is the average daily protein requirement, which is 50 grams per capita per day. And we have this misconception here that we need a lot more than that, about 70, and that's not true. We really only need about 50. Not very hard to do. They say one hamburger a day, although I don't recommend hamburger, but that equivalent of that is all we need in the way of protein per day. Another one is now we're focusing on animal-based protein, and talking again, we see the world in the heavy dark line projected from the vertical hashed line at 2010, and you can see that looking back into the past, and these rather simple-minded projections forward to 2050. And we see that the United States is at the top of the heap with the same countries above the world average and the same ones below it. So we see similar results, whether we're talking about protein in general or animal-based protein. Now we're getting into Paul Greenberg's first slide. Paul wants to address a disconnect that keeps many Americans on the sidelines of climate action. While awareness of the issue has arisen markedly, he points out the crisis seems bigger than the scope of one person. He points out that the bar graph shows that America is the biggest CO2 emitter. What can a person do that's meaningful? And this is a particularly one of the good things about Paul Greenberg's book. He does emphasize that, and that's what we're all thinking. When we see these things, we think, oh, well, that's too bad. Nothing I can do about it. But he's going to focus on things we can do about it. And he points out that the United States is the only country where many adults still deny climate change. I think that's probably true. May not be the only country, but we certainly do have a high percentage that do still. This book is meant to help you get from wherever you are right now to a better place in future, and have a look at the per capita carbon dioxide emissions of the world's leading economies. So this is not a global picture now. This is individualized, but countries from around the globe, ranging from the United States at the top to India at the bottom. Now, these per capita emissions are not diet related, of course. These are total emissions. So you can see that the next country below us is Germany. And Germany has been struggling to make do with, of course, as we know, we've talked about quite a bit, so-called renewables, water, and mostly it's sun and solar, sun and what am I thinking? Solar and wind. I'm sorry, I'm a little off this morning. And in so doing, they can't cope, and so they bring in a bit of nuclear from France, and the rest of it they get from coal, and they're still shutting down nuclear plants and building more coal plants and mining coal. So it's what I think is most amazing about this figure is to compare it with France, which is about half the carbon emissions, and yet they pay less than half Germany does for their electricity. So you can see that there's still this great competition between the two countries and denial going on both sides. Italy and the UK are more like France. Germany stands out as an outlier in Europe. Japan also pretty high because they've had to close due to public disapproval of nuclear after Fukushima, even though it wasn't nuclear itself that was at fault, but the location of their plants without proper safety walls led the populace to reject nuclear, and so they're burning various compressed gas and various types of petrol that get shipped in. China, interestingly, is coming down, and they're planning to build 150 nuclear plants in the next 10 years. Nobody's noticed that. It's never been mentioned in the news, but it's some of the good news that came out of the COP26. I did not see it in any of the general news. It's nice that they're quietly willing to go ahead and do that so they can stop building coal plants every week or two, and hopefully they'll be able to stop entirely. Anyway, that's just emissions, not related to food, but it's an introduction that Paul gives us, and I think it's still worth reviewing. Here we're coming now to the eating choices that have impact. And he says, ease up on beef and cheese, consider chicken instead. And if you look at this graph, you can see that beef is the second worst product to consume. Gives over 25 kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram of food. Lamb is interestingly is worse, and cheese and pork and farmed salmon, everybody likes to hit farmed salmon, and turkey and chicken, and it gradually comes down. And lentils, tomatoes and lentils are way at the bottom. It's interesting that tomatoes are way down there. It's not always found. I think it depends on the parameter that you're using. In this case, it's kilograms of food, not calories. And perhaps for that reason, tomatoes does pretty well. We'll look at another slide. In this case, tomatoes don't do quite so well. Let's see, where are they? Way up here. But this is not, you have to notice that this is carbon dioxide equivalent, so that would include methane release, per 1,000 calories, as opposed to here per kilogram of food. So you have to watch these different parameters. And in this case, beef exceeds that for lamb and mutton, and prawns really get a bad reputation. And Paul mentions that specifically, that the way prawns are farmed, there's a lot of destruction of mangrove trees along the borders, and also seagrass. And so they're really hard on the environment as they're now farmed. Most of the prawns that we eat are farmed. And he suggests that we think twice before we have that shrimp cocktail and have oysters or mussels instead, which are good, efficient filters and much better on the environment than farmed shrimp or prawns. Anyway, that's an interesting chart here showing cheese, poultry, milk working its way down, eggs. Brassicas, I think, are various types of vegetables in the a particular family of plants that's, I think, related to buttercups, if I remember correctly. And then the cassava and citrus fruit and rice and so on. Interesting that palm oil gets such a bad name, but it doesn't do too badly on this list. And again, instead of putting lentils at the bottom, they've got nuts at the bottom. But it's an interesting graph. That one comes from world data, not from from Paul's book, but I put it there to compare with Paul Greenberg. Now, this is also from another site. I thought it was worthwhile because it talks about seaweed and shows that of all of the things that are on the previous graphs, beef, pork, poultry, salmon, and shellfish does pretty well, as we just mentioned. But look at sugar kelp, that does extraordinarily well. I'll talk more about kelp later, but it's an interesting variety from what Paul Greenberg has to say. Coming back to his tables, he points out that fish do come with choices, and he mentions that if you take tuna, which is often called in your cans in the shopping store chicken of the sea, and people just forget that it's a large fish, and the large pelagic fish, the bigger they are on the eating chain, on the food chain, the more liters of fuel is used to catch them. These are usually done on long lines rather than on seines, per seines, and that sort of thing. And so more fuel is consumed to catch and prepare them. Flounder and other flatfish are bottom trawled. I was mentioning earlier on how much I like orange roughy, which of course is a bottom feeder from New Zealand, starting to recover now. And whenever I eat them, I feel a bit guilty because I realize that they are fished with bottom trawled nets, and that's hard on the wildlife along the sea bottoms of New Zealand area. Then there's cod and other finfish that are bottom trawled or medium. Wild salmon, cod and seines are considered one of the best medium-sized fish, and then we can always go to sardines, anchovies, and other small pelagic fish. They include pollock from Alaska, wild-caught pollock in that small category. And I recommend that because it often comes in little packages with flavoring from crab. And you can put that in salads without even cooking it. And you can put it in all kinds of mixed food dishes with pasta and so on. And it's a delightful source of very, very low carbon emission penalty. In fact, I've mentioned it up there in the sub category. Now, this slide I like most of all of the World Resource Institute slides, because it shows how when we shift our consumers' diets, that it can greatly reduce per person land use and greenhouse gas emissions. So the agricultural land use is shown in green, and the greenhouse gas emissions are in yellow. And there are some various criteria there, but they're basically based on per capita per year. So this is annually per person, how much you can do. And you see on the far left is the average US diet and how much we can reduce both land use and greenhouse gas emissions just by switching to a Mediterranean diet. Now, what do I mean by a Mediterranean diet? I'm really not sure how it's defined. I haven't Googled that one, but it, as I understand it, it involves not eating hamburgers for lunch. They don't do that in the Mediterranean area. They generally have greens, and often including tomatoes, lettuce, and various peppers and things like that to enhance the flavor, and then some cheese and wine. And that's pretty much it for a Mediterranean diet at lunchtime. And then they will have a late supper, which is fairly light on meats as well. So you can reduce significantly. Of course, they don't have steaks for breakfast like they do in Texas. And so there's an 11% reduction. But you can make that even greater if you make a specific point to shift 1/3 of your beef consumption to pork and poultry. 1/3 of whatever it is now will bring it down even more than couple of points more than if you go to a Mediterranean diet. And then if you shift 1/3 of your beef consumption, not to pork and poultry, but to legumes, that's quite a stunt, but it brings it down another point or two. And then if you reduce beef consumption by 70%, woo, what a big drop, doubles the reduction in land use and carbon emissions. And then if you reduce animal protein consumption by a half, not just beef, but animals, reduces it even more. And then a pure vegetarian, more still. So it's an interesting point for people who do not want to become vegetarians. you can still have a powerful effect by doing other things to modify your diet. This is near the end of his book, and I made some notes to deal with these 10 qualifiers that Paul Greenberg wrote. Oysters over shrimp was his first point. He says that shrimp produce about a quarter of our shellfish use, and that shrimp farming destroys mangroves. And mangroves store twice as much CO2 per acre as tropical rainforests. So they're a precious commodity, and we should therefore use shrimp more that tend to, oysters more, that leave mangroves intact, as opposed to shrimp farming. Second point, he says, consider the chicken. He says, chicken is the most emissions efficient, widely produced animal protein. You have to notice he worded that carefully. The most emissions efficient, widely produced animal protein. So it doesn't mention fish there, but it's a very useful meat if you're going to reduce your beef. Very useful meat to come back to. If every beef-eating American switched to chicken, USA would cut carbon emissions more than 200 million tons. So that's a big if. I can't imagine it happening, but it's a powerful comment. Then he says, be thoughtful with local. He points out that especially in the wintertime, if you get your food from greenhouses locally, is your farmer's market nearby? Because if you drive a long way to the farmer's market, if he's using a lot of heat and so on to keep his greenhouse warm, that might not be the best thing to do for the planet. He talks about carrots over corn and says roots rule. So carrots and parsnips give the most nutrient for the least emissions of all the vegetables you can eat. So it's an interesting thought. Then he mentions, fifth one, avoid flying food. He says the air freighted food compared with ship or rail is far more emissions. Of course, we can imagine why so. And he said, when we eat out of season berries, pineapple, asparagus, etc., those are not so stable, can't be shipped by rail or shipped so often, and need to be air freighted. And so we're going higher on the emission scale if we can avoid, if we eat flying food. And then coupled with that is point 6. Said frozen food is stable, it's transported slowly, and therefore emissions are lower, oftentimes even better for you because it's often a bit more carefully prepared sometimes, and is quite safe and good for you. The other thing is that packaging. He says, watch your waste. Packaging produces about 5% of food's carbon footprint. Well, that's number 7. I'm sorry. Buy your food naked, and then watch your waste. We've talked about that last time, and Tony Praza dealt with it very well, talking about landfills and release of methane. He points out that a lot of us buy bottled water. The average American drinks 42 gallons of bottled water per year. That is about $50 a year. And making bottles, of course, contributes 17 million barrels of oil just making the plastic for the bottles. So drink from your tap. It's generally, unless you have lead in your pipes or other contaminants, if your water is well tested, it's a good source of water. I think Madison generally is. It's a good source. And finally, plan your family. I won't get into that. Most of us have already done our family planning, but certainly population is an important factor. Moving on now to our next book, Technically Food: Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Change What We Eat. Larissa Zimberoff is a well known to the food industry. She's a freelance journalist who covers the intersection of food, technology, and business. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg Business Week, and Wired, many others. She's an expert voice at the food tech scene and appears frequently at industry conferences. She lives in the Bay Area. She's been doing this for a good 10 years, and she knows all these people quite well and has had conversations with them, and it's sort of fun to read her book and get her point of view. Not a scientist, but nonetheless. She has wanted to believe in algae for a long time. They've been around for over 1 billion years, and some species are high in protein and omega fatty acids. 50% of our oxygen comes from them. So do they taste all right? Well, the Asians like algae, but it's going to need some top marketing, she says, in America. So I tried some kelp. This is a sea otter that Akua uses. It's an interesting company, and you can see they just wrote to me. This is a little email that they said, we just shipped your order. And this is what it looks like. They're best cooked in a pan, and they're great on the grill. They're meant to be crispy on the outside and soft and chewy on the inside. I like the company, but there was a problem. The particular shipment that I ordered was supposed to come overnight from, I think, Chicago. It ended up being shipped from somewhere else. And it was about 2 weeks or at least a week and a half before we received it. And all of the dry ice had thawed. There was some moisture. There were several patties, and most of them were thawed, but a couple of them were only semi-thawed, and so we tried them. And they tasted a little bit like kelp, but it was very meat-like, and I rather enjoyed it. But then I spent some years in New Brunswick, Canada, as a boy, where people eat dolts or dried seaweed after their meal, and so I'm kind of accustomed to the seafood kelpish flavor, and I didn't find it off-putting. The problem about shipping was a serious one, and so I emailed them, and they were extremely courteous, totally reimbursed me for the entire thing, even though I managed to get one meal and a couple of patties out of it. They tended to crumble a little bit, but overall, I was happy with them, and I really liked their courtesy by email. They were very non-intrusive and very helpful. So I'm not sure how often I would try it again, but I will give them another try. This is from, I think, perhaps from one of their websites, comparison of freshwater and land use and greenhouse gas emissions for seaweed versus land crops. And it shows that comparing it with corn and wheat, and we're not against meat here, just comparing it with two common things used in a vegetarian diet, and you can see that the greenhouse gas emissions are much higher for these grains than for seaweed, which, if anything, gives back because of the photosynthesis, cuts back on greenhouse gas emissions. So land use, of course, only applies to wheat and corn, but it's not too bad. The freshwater use, though, is for making edible protein is a bit higher. So coming now to fungi. She talks about corn, and I went on the website and found out a little bit more. You can apparently ferment this mycoprotein, it's called, from Fusarium venenatum. And you can ferment this in tanks over days from 1 gram to 1,500 tons. This was first marketed 35 years ago in the UK, sold throughout Europe. It's now been owned by Mondanissen in the Philippines. It's well tolerated in human diets and uses 90% less land and water than a farm, and is supported by grants from the Department of Energy and National Science Foundation. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And I was shopping one day recently at Pick and Save, I think it was, on not far from my house. And lo and behold, I came across a box of this stuff. And they were not wrapped in separate little plastic bags. They were just, 4 of them were frozen and in a cardboard box. And amazingly, the 4 of them only cost $3.99. So I was impressed. I cooked them and in the oven at 450 degrees for 20 minutes. And I didn't add onions as is suggested in the top part of the photograph. I didn't take that picture, but I added some mustard, and it was delicious. I liked it, especially because of the tasty coating and the substantial meaty consistency. It didn't break up as much as um, the previous product from kelp. So I thought it was all right. I'm going to look for it the next time I go shopping. She also comments on soy in general, says that it's widely used, cheap and abundant. It fixes nitrogen in the soil and allows easy crop rotation. If you go to the Pope farm, you can see that they work it in, and that way they don't have to fertilize so much by using crop rotation, which has been always recommended by our university. Some proteins found in soy are among the top 8 major food allergens, however, but so that's a problem. It is still maligned for causing cancer, but there is no good evidence for that. I think that's a misidea from the fact that soy can be used as a basis chemically in the body for making estrogen, but I don't think that that's been a legitimate basis for saying that it causes cancer. Larissa takes a bit of a shot at pea protein. It's also called textured vegetable protein. It was pioneered by Worthington Foods in 1956 and now owned by Kellogg's. And it's getting more popular. What the author, Larissa, mostly objects to are these green pea snacks, which she says are extensively processed. She says the TVP trend is offset by the myth that people need meat. 98% of Americans eat more protein than the daily recommended amount. Excuse me, they're also lightly salted. Better to have your own choice on how much salt you want to use. This one I found on the web, was not in the book, but I was intrigued by it because so many times we're told that if we eat legumes, for me, cashews are the biggest offender, that they lead to gas. And I didn't realize this before, but people cannot digest oligosaccharides, such as the trisaccharide you see below, because we lack a particular enzyme called alpha galactosidase. If I remember correctly, this is a glucose molecule, a disaccharide that we have in sugar. And when we add on galactose here, it becomes a sugar in the raffinose family, and the lack of this enzyme keeps us from digesting this. And so it passes through the entire bowel system, and in the distal colon, our bacteria there digest it for us, and it generates a lot of gas. So that's why we have that problem with legumes, that some animals that can eat oligosaccharides can handle much better. Coming now to milk substitutes. There's a cute name by 2 East Indian pioneers who made this product, Moo-Free, M-U-U-F-R-I. It's an animal-free, and you can see these names of 2 East Indians. They are not only dairy-free and plant-based, but they're animal-free as well, without any animal inputs. And they're quite making quite a bit of progress. Larissa has visited with both of them and comments on it. This on the left is shown that the content of normal milk, whether it's, let's say it's 3%, we don't buy it as 3%, but as 2%. But anyway, it uses quite a lot of water and lactose and milk fat. It provides whatever level we want to buy. But the Moo-Free advantages are that in the production of this 98% less water consumption. That's quite an impressive figure if you're concerned about water use. 91% less land use, 84% less carbon emissions, and 65% less energy consumed. I haven't personally tried it. I've not seen it on the market, but those are impressive statistics to me. And once I get around to looking for substitutes for fat-free milk, I will look into that more. This is some of the efforts that they go to. They produce real milk protein, and they add milk-making genetic blueprint from a cow to tiny organisms they call microflora, of course, And just like cows, the flora need a food source, so they put in some plant sugars, and they put them in these big fermentation tanks to convert the plant sugars into milk protein, and they have a product which is identical to the protein found in cow's milk. It'd be interesting to taste it and see what its flavor is, and I can't tell you that because I haven't found it yet. Eggs are another product, not very high on the list compared to hamburger, but vegans focus on using egg white. It contains nearly 4 grams of complete protein per egg with all nine essential amino acids, although there are no vitamins there. The yolk, in contrast, is high in fats, cholesterol, and vitamins. So those are the different parts, and sometimes some people will just have the egg white, which is nice for lots of proteins, but unfortunately it misses out on the vitamins and fats. So they're into making synthetic eggs now. A chicken's egg contains about 40 proteins, and the world consumes 1 trillion eggs per year. It's a company you may have heard of called Clara Foods, and they found a yeast to be their factory. And after 4 years, a lot of investment, they came up with a product called CP280, saying that we should try it on our salad, even in our tea or soda. And they invited McDonald's to go beyond cage-free chickens to try this chicken-free substitute. I don't know much more than that about this story, but I pass it by you to be comprehensive and follow the book. One of the next chapters in Larissa's book is upcycling. We should rescue the edibles to make more edibles, and she deals with this problem of lost foods. She says the examples are snacks that we eat, from cocoa pulp, tortilla chips, leftover corn germ, coconut jerky from remnants of coconut, water production, flour from green banana peels, and so on. She says, to rescue waste, however, requires time and investment. She's a realist, after all, from Northern California. She says neither time or investment interest food companies. Until these foods are made for a globally diverse audience, it will mostly be for the curious elite who have money to spare. So that doesn't get around the problem of waste, though. This is a different thing. We're calling it upcycling. That is specifically rescuing edibles to make more edibles. The problem of waste should apply more broadly, of course. Then we come to the idea of plant-based burgers. This is becoming quite interesting, and we've talked a little bit about this before. Impossible Foods is probably the biggest company, and they claim that its burger uses 95% less land, 25% less water, and releases 89% less greenhouse gases than industrial meat production does. And given the problems that we saw with beef and sheep meat as well, that's an important accomplishment. And the second point is that they talk about heme. You can see the iron here in this heme molecule in the center of it. And that's the basis for our hemoglobin, and which carries the oxygen efficiently in that network. It's very important for us to have some heme, and animal-derived heme is absorbed into our cells more and may cause more oxidative stress than heme from vegetables, says Dr. Ornish from UCSF. This is not my photograph, but it was on, I think, a website, I've forgotten where I was looking into Impossible Burger and Beyond Beef. I have tried Beyond Beef quite a number of times, and I find it indistinguishable from regular hamburger. If anything, I like it a little more. I think it has a little more flavor, and that does not have this highly sophisticated genetically modified heme that Impossible Burger does. Theirs are supposed to be even a little tastier, according to, well, Larissa doesn't want to lose her friendship with both companies. She knows the CEOs of both companies, and so she says she just hasn't decided yet. But Impossible, she raised $1.5 billion at its initial public offering last year. Beyond raised only a third of that, but they're both doing pretty well. Pat Brown is Impossible's founder. He's a geneticist, very dedicated. And Beyond Beef, although made without heme, it seems to have pretty good flavor, by my opinion. This is a picture of Larissa here. She's tasted both burgers and liked both, perhaps favoring Impossible, but unable to get full transparency on the ingredients of either one. Um, Impossible has recently come out with pork sausage, which has a unique theme to pork. And I've never tried that. Larissa says the jury is still out. But we can go beyond that. There are two other ways that she's talked about. One is vertical farms. Can premium greens picked by robots feed the world? There's an Arrow Farms in New Jersey, it's called, claims to be the world's largest vertical farm. They claim to use less water, grow more tender kale, and ship shorter distances to market. Seeds are planted in a medium made up of either rice hulls or hemp, and they're set to grow under lights with spectra and media that are tailored to the seed. The lower use of water, lack of pesticides, and tender, tasty products are appealing, but she points out that they're still expensive. She says this is called Controlled Environment Agriculture, or CEA. She has her doubts. She says she's thinking globally, and she says, would this work in India? She says, using high tech to solve our farming problems fails to rescue the land or honor our farming legacy. Interesting point. She says, we are still left with three dilemmas: animal versus plant source of protein, reducing food waste, and distributing food efficiently. This controlled environment agriculture needs engineers, electricity 24/7, efficient trucks, and plastic packaging. So she has some issues with that. She also does deal with the waste problem. Agriculture is responsible for 30% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases and 80% of deforestation. Those are pretty severe criticisms. 1.2 billion tons of food is wasted on farms each year. 370 million dollars of food is wasted on the farm. Reducing this could support significant progress towards no poverty and zero hunger, particularly in low-income countries, where post-harvest waste amounts to 291 million tons each year. Points out that 58% of global harvest stage waste occurs in high and middle income countries, Europe, North America, and industrialized Asia. And finally, 2.2 gigatons equivalent, CO2 equivalent, is the overall carbon footprint from food stage food waste. Approximately 4% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and 16% of agricultural emissions are from the farms. This is equivalent to 75% of all cars, drivers in the United States and Europe over a year. So there's a lot of improvement that could be done. I'm glad that we learned from Alison Duffy a few weeks ago how the efforts are being made to reduce that waste problem and make it more efficient, but there needs to be a lot more done. Finally, there's this last subject of cell-based meat. So we're not talking about plant-based as opposed to beef. We're talking about taking cells from a cow, a beef cow, or bull, I guess, and growing them as stem cells from the muscle, and or possibly even subcutaneous cells. I'm not exactly sure what cells they use, but they end up harvesting stem cells. These are cells that can differentiate into several different lines, and they select, and it took them quite a while to start making food. They first started in 2013. The company is called Mosa Meat. It's a Dutch startup. Mark Post raised $75 million in 2020 to keep it going. The founders are two men, one a cardiologist and the other an oncologist. And there's another company called Memphis Meats in Berkeley, which is doing the same sort of thing with chicken. This is some of the work that they do in the lower left. You see they put out these little cells and they grow them around a central little spigot, and then they split it and clone them out into these little forms, and you can see the striations, and then they cut these things up and end up with a myotube over here on the right. It's pretty tricky and intensive, But they end up with this sort of a thing in a petri dish. They add some fat tissue, which is important for taste and texture. This is an important part of making the product like the ground beef that people currently consume. There's no point in having a pure protein. It's good to have a little fat in there. We developed a culture medium, he says, that is free of fetal bovine serum, and that's good because most tissue cultures do require 10 or 15% of that, some at 5%, but this medium is free of that, and that's good because it means we do not get the antibiotics that probably leak into fetal bovine serum because we give our cows antibiotics and vaccinate them and put drugs into them of all sorts, and this is totally free of that. So that's a big plus. And this is a picture of Mark Post. His proudest claim is, we improved our meat's protein content, allowing the cells to produce more myoglobin and red color. Myoglobin is similar to blood hemoglobin, made by the muscle cells, not by the bone marrow. It provides oxygen transport within the cell, so it's very similar to hemoglobin. Also a source of heme, iron, and meat, and adds to its flavor. So he's quite proud of that, and I think that although it's going to be expensive, he'll finally bring the prices down. I'm skipping some of the fine points at the end of her book to come up with this prediction by the Economist magazine that I happen to subscribe to. They have two interesting figures here. The first one is entitled Alternative Protein Investment in Billions of Dollars. And you can see that since 2013, we've been gradually increasing. Of course, the Economist focuses on investments. And so that you can see that first we're starting with cultivated protein, then let's see, no, plant-based, I'm sorry, it's inverted from there. The plant-based would be at the bottom, I believe. And then the light green would be fermentation, examples that we showed there of fermenting mycoprotein and that sort of thing. And then cultivated at the top. It's a little hard to understand exactly what those parameters mean, but we can more or less guess. On the right, we have meat market trends and the forecast starting in 2025 and going out to 2040. And at the present time, you can see we invest I'm not sure what TRN stands for. I should have looked it up. Trillion, maybe 1.2 trillion. That's sure a lot of money. But they anticipate that will go up to 1.8 trillion. And there's the conventional meat on the top. Then the vegan substitute products are starting now. 2025, of course, is still 4 years away, but they're anticipating that it'll be roughly 10% of the market, of the meat market. And we're not yet, they think, won't be very far along with cultured meat yet. But look, they're thinking that will go up by 2040. That's just 15 years to over 30% of the market. And as we cut back our conventional meat use from about 90% now to cut back to 60%. So 40%, I mean, subtracting from the top. So it does have a future, according even to a conservative magazine like The Economist. And hopefully that will give us more choices, because to ask people to become vegetarian, it's a tall order. Some people accept it readily, but unless introduced to it at a young age, sometimes when you get to be a certain age, you like to cut back on beef. That's one thing, but to cut back on all meats is a tall order for some of us. And so by having these cultured meats, I think so far the primitive attempts that I've made interest me a lot. I wouldn't mind to try more kelp and fungus type burgers. And I haven't eaten a regular hamburger for quite a long time, and I don't plan to. So there's an organization called Drawdown that Dr. Desai introduced us to about a year ago. And I was looking at their website, and they've made this interesting table. And I think that it's an interesting one to look back on. It's hard to interpret. I've entitled it, it helps us to appreciate what we might do. And I put on the left, maybe we should rethink what we eat. Um, it, it's really tricky. I did some addition of these various percentages that you see here in bold print, and they only add up to 25%. So my guess is that his top 20 high impact climate actions for households and individuals, which I like, that he focuses on, um, they think that makes up 25% of the emissions. And so of that 25%, then a 12 and a quarter and 0.4%, or about half of that 25%, could be based on reduced food waste or plant-rich diets. Each one of those is would be about 6.25%. Those numbers there are. I'm not sure if I can fiddle with that. I don't seem to be able to. It's obstructed, but basically, um, uh, it's a it's a number related to carbon emissions and millions of tons of carbon emissions or something like that. And so you can see those numbers for plant-rich diets, 102. That's a pretty big number. When you compare that with food, all the waste that we do, Tony talked about it last time, recycling, 11.3, 1/10 as much as having a plant-rich diet. Reduced use of plastic, even lower, 5.4, composting, 3 roughly, recycled paper, 1.4. So if you recycle your paper and think you're doing a lot, boy, there's a lot of room for improvement. Then if you come to travel, public transit, the very top of all of the things we could do is use more public transit, 15.4. Carpooling, though, is a close second. Electric cars comes in third at 9.8. Hybrid cars, 4.7. Telepresence, what we're doing now instead of driving to Oakwood, 4.4. Electric bicycles, that gets a pretty low score because I guess compared to regular bicycles, it's not a, or I don't know why it's so low. But since you can only put one person on a bicycle, they give it a fairly low score there. And then on energy, distributed solar photovoltaics, they give a pretty big number there, 64. If you have solar panels on your roof, they're just insulating your home is pretty good. LED lighting cuts back a bit, solar hot water a bit. High performance windows, 11. High efficiency heat pumps, 9, and smart thermostat, 7. Low flow water fixtures, not so much. But I think that was an interesting thing that I happened to find from, it was a graphic designed by Chad Frischman, and he is a major data collector and manipulator of data for this company called Drawdown, right? And I found that their attitude on nuclear is extremely, I shouldn't say extremely, pretty low. When they make predictions, if you go on their website, Project Drawdown, they have a lot of emphasis on wind and solar, and they don't rule out nuclear, but they certainly don't plan to enlarge it very much. It's they want to keep it pretty much the way it is now, and that disappoints me. But other than that, I find many of their other subjects are interesting. So before we leave the subject, this slide came by, and I thought it was worthwhile talking about water because not only are we concerned about carbon emissions, but water use, particularly if you live out in California or in any place that tends to be dry. And when you compare a single grape uses a third of a gallon of water for one grape, and then you look at a walnut, which is 5 gallons for a walnut, and then compare that with 634 gallons for a hamburger, you realize that our choices do have a huge impact. Now, mind you, a single grape is not going to satisfy one's appetite or provide as much protein as a hamburger, but boy, the amount of water there is huge. It's about almost a 2,000-fold difference, so it's incredible. Well, I think we have time for questions, and I have another slide, but I would rather hold that for after our questions. So it's 5 to 11. We've got an hour and 5 minutes, lots of time for questions. I do want to have a little discussion at the end, but I'm going to stop the slide share and come back to this later so that I can see and interact with you a little bit more. on questions. So I'm open, and we'll look forward to seeing your questions. Let's see, I have 4 here under chat. First one is from Lee. She says, that per capita CO2 emissions graph does not show that in total. China has much greater CO2 emissions than the US because they have many more coal burning power plants. Okay, we'll have to go back and look at that slide, Lee. I presume you're talking about one of the very first slides. So we'll look at that next time I go back to the slide. But you make a good point. George Erickson says, Japan has begun reopening its nuclear plants. That's true. George, I didn't mention that, but I was just talking generally. I'm glad to see that starting to happen. I hope that it happens more. I think it'll only happen partially. And Lee helps me to define brassicas. She say they include broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and she puts question mark kale. Probably that is also a brassica. Thank you for that definition. Lee also says when you eat legumes, take Beano. It gives you enzyme to help digest them. Very good point. Thank you for that. I always forget to take it, but I have it handy, and I should start to use it more. Dr. Erickson says, Drawdown has not done the science on inefficient resource gobbling, environment damaging short-lived solar, which ends up as hazardous waste. Very good point. Totally agree with you. They saw some things this morning about flexible solar panels and how they're going to become into use. I did some research on that to see if I could put them on the wings of my airplane, and found that it would cost $35,000 to provide 11% more range, and thought that was way out of line. And those flexible solar panels are not a great advantage. It's just that you can use them in more places on curving surfaces. But they did mention in the website, I got that off of Tree Hugger today. Tree Hugger is a neat guy, and he has 4 or 5 interesting things every day to read. And he had one about solar panels, and it pointed out that although Europe has some firm laws about recycling the panels when they run out of profitability or significant function after 20 to 25 years, the United States has made no such regulations, and at the moment they just go into landfills with no attempt whatsoever to recycle any of the materials. There are no laws, no requirements. It's a Wild West mentality, and yet we still push solar panels like incredible, and yet nobody's thought about it or made any laws to deal with it. So your point's well taken, George. Dorothy Bogman says the slide with China's lower emissions was because it is per capita. I think you're right, and I think that's a reply to Lee. When it is per capita, China's emissions are lower than ours. So that's a good point. Thank you for that correction, Dorothy. That's a good point to make. You have to watch all these criteria very, very carefully. Dr. Rickers raised a hand. Let's see what that was. I'm not sure that I try that one. Don't see anything from Dr. Rickers. I wonder if you could send it through Q&A, Dr. Rickers. I might be able to find it there. I'm clicking on, I can allow you to talk, Dr. Rickers, if you'd like to say hi. Oh, can you unmute us, Dorothy?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't get the thing in the chat, but one thing that is a huge advantage of getting away from meat-based protein from animals is the disgusting job we have done over the past 10,000 years of civilization in treating our domestic animals, and especially now where we grow chickens to the size that they can't walk and on and on. So I think that that's another huge advantage that isn't in addition to the energy saving.
Completely agree with you. For people who spend a lot of time in emotion, dealing with the humane treatment of animals, and I think we all should, but we focus very much on our pets and don't realize that the food we eat is from animals that are just treated so badly, and chickens is a classic example. So thank you for that. Yeah, if we can get to better use of these cultures so that we can even avoid, well, if we cut back, we probably just won't have such crowding, hopefully not so much anyway, of and mistreatment of animals. We're always going to have farms, but if we don't have such mass farms, we can get back to more family-sized farms maybe someday, where we honor the farm as we used to think of it, as a family farm, where animals were treated with more respect. So very good point. Let's see, chat, coming back to the chat. Doug Edwards has a question. Just to let you know that I am preparing, and it disappears. That's an email from Doug. I'm not sure if he wants to join us or whether that's an email that I can comment on now. I do want, in a little while, when we've dealt with the questions, to show one more slide. Dorothy mentions silvopasture is good for the earth and keeps both plants and animals in balance. Good point. And I think you talked to us about silvopasture a couple of years ago, and using perennial plants as well to be kinder to the earth. So I appreciate that. We should perhaps have a talk on that again sometime. We might add it to our list of things to speak about. One of the things that I'm going to ask that we do next spring is to have a series of at least 10 topics to talk about and talk about as a group, and perhaps do away with slides altogether and simply describe what interests us on various topics. And that might be a good way for you, Dorothy, and others to lead discussions about silvopasture. That way we don't have to bother making slides. It's a lot of work. And that's why I would like to, I've enjoyed it. I learn a lot by preparing slides, but I think it divides the work up more and allows more interaction if we have more discussion groups and fewer lectures. So that's my plan for next spring, and we'll go into that in a few more minutes. But thank you for that suggestion. Any other thoughts here? Dr. Rickers, did you have any other comments?
Oh, no, I don't, Richard.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for coming. I appreciate that point. It's a very good one. Okay. Let's see. I don't see any other questions or comments. One new message says, did anyone hear about the coming fertilizer shortages? A little bit, but that's a good question, Lee. It was implied in Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And he was pointing out that we're simply not going to have enough fertilizer, and how difficult it is to make it and how much emissions they cause, the manufacture of them release. So that is possibly a good subject to talk about. Let me add that onto my list. I've had two suggestions already, and I appreciate that. one on silvopasture, and it's 2 out of 4 that I'm looking for. Great. Put that down as 7, and 8 is coming fertilizer shortage. And there's another one. If you garden, you might want to start composting. Indeed, composting is a good thing. I do that now and have for a long time, but I don't compost as well as I should. I just put all my plant pruning from my meadow there so that it doesn't get chewed up in some chopper and or burned. And so it just decays very, very slowly, makes a really nice habitat for rabbits, and which I don't mind at all, except they do sometimes nip a few flowers. But it would be good if we put our food waste there, and we haven't gotten to that yet, but it would certainly reduce methane, I think, from rotting in landfills, methane release. Although at least at our landfill, we did visit there a few years ago and saw that they were harvesting the methane that comes off of the landfills, and it actually generates enough electricity to be quite useful to our plant. In fact, you may have seen it. I think it may have been on 60 Minutes or some other program that was fairly widely available, that Madison ranked as a fairly unique recycling plant across the country, and got the national news. And Tony has been working hard to have us make a tour there. We made a tour of their landfill, but not of the recycling plant. The video that was shown, that Tony showed a while back, was wonderful. It was almost as good as taking a tour there. And that, I'm sure, is still available online for those of you who may have missed it. You can go to platomadison.org and look for the recorded ones. And I'm pretty sure Tony's is still there, and he has the links there, or you can email him and he'll send it to you, I'm sure, as well. That was a wonderful visit, Tony. We haven't been able to go there in person, of course, because of COVID. They don't have parking there, and so we'd have to carpool, and we were just reluctant to do that with the continuing persistence of COVID in the environment. Okay, 3 participants have raised hands. So let me try. Anything else? Those are all good points. Appreciate those. Let's try Q&A. Can you unmute me? You bet. Let's see if I can try that, George. Thank you for that suggestion. I'll see if I can come around to viewing gallery. Participants. Tony's there. Thank you, Tony, for coming. Here's George, allowed to talk. Okay, George. I think you're unmuted.
Okay, do you hear me?
I do. Thank you.
Very good. First of all, I want to thank you for doing these programs. You make my Monday mornings. I find them really interesting, and I appreciate the work that you do, rounding up people, and then the programs you do yourself. I think it's very useful and rewarding. I would miss it if you quit. And then, do you plan? Can you give us either by email later or now a little summary of what's planned from now on for a while? And then I also want to put in a pitch for a really good book by 2 people who are not scientists, but they have done their homework. and the title is Bright Green Lies. They are fervently anti-alternative energy, wind and solar. And they've done their homework, they've done the math, their sources are good. They don't say much about nuclear because that's not their focus. And the little bit they do say about it is close enough to benign so I can't complain. So that's a high praise.
Yes.
So if you have a chance, I recommend checking the reviews and buying the book. It's not cheap, but it is very good and very thorough.
Thank you for that, George. I appreciate your comments, all of them. With regard to Bright Green Lies, I bought a copy and I have it and would be glad to lend it to people. Anybody who wants, I could send it to you, or I could bring it in person in February the 21st when we start our sessions at Oakwood. I think you're very kind to the authors. They've done their research on Bright Green Lies. I was disappointed, not so much that they omitted nuclear, which I can understand, but I was left with a feeling that if you take away wind and solar as extremely as they seemed to want to do, and you also, George, you're left rather depressed. What else do we have? The hydro is not working very well. We can't add very much. We're losing water. And so I had this real down feeling after reading the book that what can we do? There were no positive solutions, or very few, I thought, in that book. So that was my negative from it.
I agree. They should, ideally, they should say, here's the alternative, rapidly expand modern nuclear power with some of the new reactor types, including modular.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that they have a right to not go into it in detail. But if you're in touch with the author and the authors, and they do write a second edition, you could suggest to them that they give the public at the end something positive to latch onto, and they certainly could make that statement without becoming nuclear engineers in the process.
Good point.
I will then, given your comments and the fact that it's 10 after 11, I will go back to my last slide, if that's okay, if everybody can hang on. I think we've covered everyone. Let me just double check. I think so. So let's try screen share. I will come back to speaker only, and then I will try screen sharing from my last slide. Okay. So here it is. Topics for the spring of 2022. I can send this to any of you who would like, but I would probably modify it now after George's comments and suggestions from Lee and Dorothy. But what I've put up here are climate conclusions from Project Drawdown, although I have some reservations, I think, about it not being quite negative on nuclear and a little bit overboard on wind and solar, maybe more than a little bit, George would say. It's still worthwhile looking at, but maybe we can drop that if we discuss a little bit more ahead of time. I definitely want to include number 2, the new hydrogen economy. I mentioned earlier on that there are several different shades of hydrogen: gray, the way we make it now; green, if we use nuclear or some other clean source of energy for making hydrogen. I think there's a lot to that economy. I've talked to Doug Edwards about it, and Doug didn't come up with a strong point for this year, but I'm sure I could get Doug interested in participating in that discussion in the spring. I know you're listening, Doug, so there's my encouragement to you to do so, to help us out with that one. Then maybe Lee could help us with the third one, and others. serious batteries, that's my word, serious batteries for storing intermittent energy. This is beyond what Lee's been doing. She built her own electric vehicle, but we're talking about storing intermittent energy. And there's some liquid batteries that are being discussed. Bill Gates talked about them. I think we should have a go at how feasible it is to store our intermittent energy. Word I've got from it is that so far, we've got something like 10 minutes of storage tucked away for the national grid, maybe even less than 10 minutes. So we have a long way to go, but it'd be interesting to know what the future is in that. Point 4 was, why should we care about biodiversity? We hear a lot about it. Are we just sorry because we'd lose some pretty birds and pretty species, or is it much deeper than that? I think it is, and I think we should talk about it because biodiversity is a whole part of looking after our planet. The 5th point is the highs and lows of electric vehicles. Lee has talked to us a bit about it, and every time she does, I get very positive feedback from the group. I think that we'd like to hear more about that. And Lee, again, you don't have to give a talk. But you can be a leader, a discussion leader for that. We can prepare for that. Point 6, I talked about this years and years ago. There's a book called what would it be like if we went to 6 degrees? 6 degrees is a little high. I'm not to say that 4 isn't, but I have a feeling we're going to get to 4 because I can't see us. I think it's totally unrealistic to think that we'll stop at 1.5 degrees of increase over global temperatures. I think they like to use as a baseline 2005, and I think we're very easily going to exceed 1.8. Some people would say 2.5, others would say 3.5. So what I thought of as a topic is, and we could all do a bit of reading on that. What would it look like? How much ocean water rise? How much fires? How much glacier depletion would happen after 4 degrees? I think it would be pretty severe, and I think we're going to get there. Probably not this century, but within another couple of centuries, we'll probably be there. But I think that we will slow down. I don't think we'll go to the high curve. I'm hoping that the species is intelligent enough to not go up to 6 degrees, as Mark Linus predicted in one of his books. Anyway, that's an interesting topic that we could try and grapple with seriously. And then we just added a bunch more. Composting, fertilizer shortages, impending silvopasture. And so send me emails. You have my email address, and coot42@gmail.com. So send me emails and add to this list. I'll winnow through them. Tony and I will look at them. Tony was going to send you out a survey. And that was very kind of him. He sent me an email about it this morning, and I suggested to him that I'd rather change the whole format a bit so that we have just more input from people and a little less lecturing. It doesn't have to be excluding lectures, but I would, if we could have a discussion leader and just more of a group. And if we'll be at Oakwood, it'll be easier to do. But the idea of the hybrid working at Oakwood was people like George or like Alan and others from a distance away. Lou Harnish, if Lou is there, he's from down near Chicago. We can come in with those people through Zoom, and that's the whole idea of it being hybrid. They've had a whole semester of experience with this with the Tuesday morning group, and it's worked very well. So there's some experience in doing this hybrid technology, and I think it would give us the best of both worlds. We'd have the opportunity to bring in people from a distance, as well as have more personal discussions one-on-one during a group discussion, and not quite so much lecturing. We could still have a few lectures here and there. There's nothing ruling that out, but I would like to see more group discussion. So any comments or thoughts on this? I still have this slide up, but I think I could handle some Q&A. Let's see anything there. Any comments from anyone? Tony, do you have any comments? I see you still there. Can I allow you to talk?
Yes, you just unmuted me.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that I would be happy to lead a talk on biodiversity as long as it's a discussion type
Good.
format.
Thank you. Okay, that would be great.
Richard, this is Tony.
Yes, hi, Tony.
Hi. Really related to the hybrid approach that you talked about, both last meeting and this meeting, as far as the consideration, I think is an excellent idea.
Good.
The items that you already identified, as far as the climate conclusion for Project Drawdown, I'd be more than willing to lead that discussion.
Good.
And I do think they're doing some excellent work. Indirectly, I know the individual that heads up Project Drawdown. I'm not sure how much of additional I can get from him, because I know that group is fairly busy, but we'll see what I can pull from them.
Good. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Let's see, the other thing associated with the presentation, one of the factors that a little bit surprised me, and I guess there's some consideration, I'm not sure exactly how, but kelp actually had a negative CO2 impact. Is it because when we pull kelp out of the oceans, it draws down more CO2? I'm not sure about how that comes to be. So.
Yeah, it can make a mess during storms. They have strong holdfasts that hold them down to the bottom, but if the storm is bad enough, they can wash up and smell. Not as much as, or not any more than other refuse from the ocean, but kelp is a big plant, and it can really smell when it's up on shore. But I think the points that I made about kelp still hold on those graphs. What people also don't realize is that underwater plants and phytoplankton provide 50% of our oxygen. If we were to lose those things, I think we'd still have enough oxygen to get by, but provided that we don't keep burning down the Amazon, which we're doing at quite a rate. I understand the size of a state, of one of our smaller US states, gets burned every year in the Amazon. So we can't rely on our trees when we've got 50% of our oxygen being made in the ocean. So we need to really take care of it. And so when I'm talking about harvesting kelp, I wouldn't want to see vast quantities of kelp removed, but it grows at a rate that I think it could be done in a way that would be better than, for example, farming shrimp, where you're taking down mangroves and interfering with seagrass. I think the kelp could be done in a very sustainable way. I don't know in detail how Aqua is doing it, and since they write me emails now and again and seem so pleasant to interact with, I might write to them and ask them about how they farm their kelp. AQUA, by the way, in case you ever want to look on their website, AQUA.com, I think is a website for kelp, and we could, I will try and do that and get back to you. But that's a good point, Tony. Thank you for that and for your comments. I'm really pleased that people are coming forward. I'll make a new list than the 6 that I have here and send them around. Maybe come up and we can modify it a little bit, but I'll put discussion leaders on one side of the right side of the page and the titles on the left side, and we can keep sending them back and forth and adding and subtracting and changing them around and putting on dates. But they will start on February 21, Monday, and I'll mention it to Paul Thompson that I got a good response with you all today, and we'll make some serious plans to transfer to this hybrid system at Oakwood. George, do you think you'd be able to come and continue with us if we have a Zoom arrangement and do the hybrid? I think we're able to hear you, George. George might have left us by now, but anyway, I'll continue that conversation with George Erickson. We'd like to have his input as well as others from out of town. but that's nice. And thank you, Tony, for your input. It's now 11:25. Before I wrap up, let's stop this slide share and see if anybody has any further comments.
Richard, I don't know if you saw what I put in the chat there. I was just thinking that, maybe we could like come up with a couple of slides just as talking points, like, for example, and with electric vehicles, have one slide of advantages and another slide of disadvantages. And then other people might think of additional things, from starting from that base.
That's a good idea. Another thing that I did, Lee, if you're a discussion leader for a particular thing, we'll get an estimate of the number of people present, but generally at Oakwood, I wouldn't guess that our numbers would be much more than a dozen or 15 or so, and that's what they've been in the past. And we sometimes would have on one page, just print out a dozen pages, a dozen copies, and just have them at the entry. So when people come in, they have that to go by, and then could make notes on the margins or the back, the reverse, and that works out pretty well too. And you don't have to bother with a slide. So that's another alternative.
Okay, but only the people that live at Oakwood would be at Oakwood. Is that the way that works?
Oh, no, we'd wear a mask, I'm afraid. And we would come just as we always have been. We usually get 2 or 3 residents only, but maybe we'll get more. So no, this is just the way we used to do it in the old days before COVID.
Okay,
And,
so all of us would drive in and just be there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would definitely hope that we all could. I mean, there might be some people who say, gee, I don't feel like it today. I'm not up to it. I think I'll join in by Zoom, but I'm hoping that we still have a pretty good attendance. Yeah.
Sure, okay.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay. Well, very good. I'm really glad we had this conversation, and I've enjoyed doing this, and I appreciate your feedback very much. It's makes my day, but I think the evolution back to a greater discussion will be good for everybody,
Good.
including me. Yes, Dorothy.
What we did very early on in the class, I was in your class from the beginning, is sometimes we assigned an article that people could read, and that formed a sort of a common base that the discussion leader would lead off on. So that's another thing. And I still think it's useful for someone leading a discussion to be able to have some information on slides or some way of sharing information, because it's kind of hard if there's numerical data to just talk about it.
Sure. I quite agree with both points. I was planning on assigning an article for everybody to read. If it's just something simple, Dorothy, I think we could just bring a sheet on, but on the other hand, for everybody to pick up as they come in. But on the other hand, if you could either bring your computer or give your slides to me, and then I would project them from my computer onto the regular system screen that they have there. I think that would work too. So thank you for that. Good suggestions all. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a really nice Thanksgiving holiday and good winter. I'll try and stay in touch through the winter and look forward to seeing you all on February 21st. Quite a break, but we've got lots to prepare. And I'm really pleased by the suggestions that you've given me this morning for adding to it. So, so long to all. Best wishes. Happy holidays.